Hi there. So today we're going to talk about ideology. And what is ideology and how is this a theory of protest? So let's get into the definitions. So ideology is a belief system, often political or economic in nature, that instructs or dictates a person's set of values or beliefs. So think about ways in which we believe that the world works. So for example, one ideology is democracy. We believe that if we help the most people make the most set of decisions, then that is ultimately the right decision. And I am a big fan of democracy, and I think democracy is very important. But other people see the world differently. Think about back in history when we had kings. Kings were believed to be gods or higher beings, and I was just a lonely peasant whose voice didn't really matter because I didn't think that I had the intelligence nor the wherewithal nor my voice to have an impact in ways in which the world should be. There are different ways in which I understand the world and that peasant understands the world that ultimately influence how I see the way the world works. There's also economic ideologies. So some people believe in the free market, which is more of a liberalist ideology that ultimately we should just let the market exist the way it does without government influence, that every business should be able to buy and sell whatever it wants. And so this ultimately forms a economic value in which the way that the world should work. Whereas other people believe in more progressive socialism, where the government and the businesses should work together for the best outcome for its people, like taxing businesses so that people who don't have jobs or who are homeless can get access to healthcare or get access to housing. So ideology is really interesting because it's hard to grasp your own ideology because it seems like a belief system. One of my favorite ways of comparing an ideology is to compare it to religion. Ideology and religion are typically very comparative to each other, right? A religion, if you are Christian or you are Muslim or you are a Jewish person, right? You believe in a certain way in which the world works through your God that is given to you and your holy texts, in which the way the world works. And the same thing, we do this culturally. We believe that democracy works, or we believe that our king is a god, or we sometimes believe that the free market is the absolute way in which it is best, and businesses need that free market to survive. Whereas other people believe that businesses are somehow corrupt, and that we need to regulate them through the government so that society can be peaceful. And so this is a belief system. So examples of ideologies might be liberalism. Liberalism is a belief in absolute freedom, that every person should have a freedom in the way they live. So you can think about the values and behaviors that exist if you believe in absolute freedom. Typically, liberals believe in access to abortion because it's an individual freedom. The free market, which is an absolute freedom. The legalization of marijuana and other drugs that are absolute freedoms, right? Because liberalisms believe that the ultimate way a society should run is that an individual should have a right to choose. Oh, also gay marriage, right? Liberals believe in gay marriage because that is a absolute freedom of the individual to get married to whoever they want, right? This is a belief that ends up instructing the values that I carry and the behaviors that I carry. Conservatism, as a contrary to liberalism, right, believes in traditional values, that there are ways in which people have existed in the past and that our parents lived and our grandparents lived that helped create a good society. And so we should carry these values that are traditional into the future and live by these values. And the more that we change or divert from these values, the more it hurts the American people, right? Or just people in general, as conservatism exists outside the U.S. Capitalism, a belief in property owning, right? That I can go and buy an apartment complex and I can then rent each of those apartment complexes and accrue capital, accrue money that exists based on the land that I own. Whereas some other people might not believe that that is fair, right? For example, invest a bunch of money in the stock market, my stock goes up, and I have accrued capital, right? I've accrued money from the money. The money has generated money. Versus socialism, that like the government should regulate basic necessities like healthcare or property for renting and values, that they should be shared in some sense with the government and regulated by the businesses to create some sort of space in which everyone has their basic needs. Versus religions, right? Religions function as a part of an ideology that becomes a way in which we see it. Sometimes people will say a Christian ideology because Christians believe, right, certain things in which the way the world should work. And ultimately, you might have one ideology or another ideology, and these ideologies are not always black and white. They typically vary and change. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. Discourse is the ways in which ideologies change over time and produce and influence how people believe and act. So not every ideology stays the exact same all the time, depending on the scholar and the ways in which we understand this. So for example, this is Foucault. Foucault is famous for studying discourses, and he was a gay man back in the 1960s, and what he wanted to analyze was how medical information, especially about psychiatry and psychology, had changed over time. And specifically talking about how, like, for example, women back in the day, when they were facing mental health issues from being forced to stay at home and being housewives, or how gay men were labeled as mentally unwell and sick for being gay, and how these two things were kind of under the guise of psychology or psychiatry, and these were shifting what truth was, right? That people believed that gay people were inherently not of value. And so it's interesting to think how over time science has changed into what we believe, right? People used to believe that like thunder was brought down by the gods, and over time science has changed so we understand how the weather works. But it doesn't always necessarily change for the good or better, especially when we think about like psychology, or a lot of times Foucault talked about like how people view sex, and what sex is largely a cultural thing that changes over time. And so how does ideology change in which the ways we think about sex over time is another thing that Foucault studied. So how can I participate in it, right? Maybe I am a psychologist, right? And I'm producing research, more and more research, and over time, based on protests, based on ways in which people have fought for their rights, right? It changes over time. I mean, even back in the day, even in like as early as like the 40s, before the civil rights movement, people were often fighting because people said that black people were inherently, for some biological reason, inferior to white people. We now know that to be ridiculous, because our ideology and the ways in which we view science change, but science did change over time, and at that time, science is what they told them. This is the truth that they held about the world, right? Which is how, scientists and civil rights leaders protest and advocate and change in what we think is real over time. And so it's definitely interesting to think about how these change. Hegemony is the ways in which I can participate, and how I can challenge it, but ultimately the truth remains the same, or the truth just changes variably, right, over time. So it was written by Gramsci. Gramsci is a famous person. He was a socialist during the time of World War II, and he was fighting against, and he was imprisoned and ultimately killed by Italians who arrested him for his ideas, and he famously wrote prison notebooks about how he felt being arrested and being in prison. And so one way in which I like to think about hegemony, and think about, because it says retain its truth often through leadership and dominance, is the idea that, like, we used to believe, for example, like gay people were sick. And now we still have different ways in which we think people are inherently sick, right? We can still think about ways in which people with schizophrenia are inherently sick, or people with depression are inherently sick, or how anxiety is inherently sick. And I know these are things that do have value, and I have anxiety and depression, and I think about them, but the ways in which we think about them have changed culturally, right? And so hegemony is the idea that even though things change, it's always centered around like, this is absolutely true. So what we think about absolutely true today might change in the next 50 years about how we think about mental health, but it ultimately will change, but it ultimately remains true. So one of my favorite examples of this is Banksy. So Banksy, famously, he's a street artist who used to do graffiti, and the graffiti often had a political message in nature. And because this political message was so powerful, and it was seen in during certain and specific times very powerful, that he started gaining a lot of notoriety, and people started selling his works, literally cutting the walls out or cutting canvases out, and transferring things onto canvas and selling his work for profit. And he didn't like this, right? He thought that was unethical, that people were selling his work for profit. And so what he did was he put one of his most famous paintings in a canvas, and then he secretly installed a shredder in the canvas. You can go look up the video. It's interesting. As they sell the painting for $1.4 million, the painting begins to shred itself. He is resisting, he is protesting the selling of his art, right? The interesting thing about it is, even though it's shredded, that art that was initially worth $1.4 million, now the half-shredded piece of art is now worth $25 million. It is crazy to think that even though he is protesting his art, what remains true in the art world is remaining true in the art world, that the message of the art is now even more valuable, even though the message is stop selling my art. Ultimately, the protest worked and became viral and became interesting, but the protest only increased the value of his art, which is the exact opposite effect he wanted. So how hegemony works is it resists that change, right? It resists and always wants to be true. And so I think that's always really fascinating. So some theories of protest. One theory of protest is called uncivil tongue. It analyzes civility. So when we think about a protest, what does it mean to be a civil protest? Some people, for example, this is of the Women's March, one of the largest marches ever in history, right? That it is women marching in the streets, stopping traffic, stopping freeways, stopping things. And people might say that this is uncivil. Civility just means to be polite and formal in discussion, but typically what is civil is dominated by whoever is deciding what is civil, right? Is kneeling at a football game civil or not civil? Is protesting in the streets civil or not civil? Is protesting on a college campus civil or not civil? And this is a theory of protest that says, you know what? No matter how I protest, someone or something, especially the person that I am calling out, that I am protesting, will always call it uncivil, because protest is inherently disruptive. And so it is a tool in which we punish people who protest, this concept of civility, which I think is super interesting. We can also think of powers, like material powers, cultural powers, or relational powers. People who are dominant groups typically have powers through material, which is things like cash, factories, military power, right? These are material powers. There are cultural powers in which I have power over someone through cultural means. I like to think about how common McDonald's restaurants are, right? McDonald's restaurants are even in China, there's McDonald's restaurants pretty much all over the world, because America has a cultural power where what's called a hegemon, a leader, is where hegemony comes from, that influences other cultures, right? And then we have relational powers. Relational powers, think about how your mom can influence you to do something because she has a relationship with you and leverages that relationship to make you do something, right? America can have relational powers over the Middle East. America can have relational powers over the UN. America can have relational powers over Mexico, over Canada, right? And so these are the types of powers we talk about when we are talking about dominant groups and powerful groups influencing ideology and influencing economic processes. So if you have any questions, let me know. I think this is a fun lecture, though.